ever so gently inviting you to take a seat. Patience wearing thin, inviting you to, no, I'm kidding. It is my great honor to introduce my friend and colleague, Matt Siegel. When I started as a faculty member in 2010, having been away for several years, I came back, and the first thing I think Robert pulled me aside to tell me about was this new kid on the block who everybody was talking about. And it very quickly became clear that Matt was brilliant. And I had the good fortune of working with him while he was a student, and I have the even better fortune of counting him my colleague now. Matt is, as you guys know, an extraordinary teacher, an extraordinary public intellectual, really. His work in sharing the mission and vision of the PCC faculty beyond what we do in our classroom, on the internet, through his YouTube profile, Twitter or X or whatever the hell I'm supposed to call it nowadays. He's just been wonderful that way. And part of the testimony to Matt's capacities as a scholar is his capacity to collaborate. He's one of the most just implicitly collaborative, scholarly people I've ever met. He reaches out and forms relationships, friendships, builds scholarly communities like the one we're all in here today, which is in many ways partially a testament to things that Matt helped get off the ground. The online program was his brainchild, so we're very grateful to him. He's going to be talking to us about science, religion, and Earth evolution tonight, looking especially at some of the thinking of Teilhard and Whitehead, who you all probably met many times inside your courses. That's not an accident. Teilhard and Whitehead are some of the figures that lie at the basis for how PCC has thought about consciousness, how we've thought about philosophy, metaphysics, and those things. That doesn't mean we think about them uncritically, or that we just repeat what they say or kind of put them on echo. As you'll see from the way that Matt's going to engage with them, we think about them critically, constructively, with charity, and let them open up whole new pathways for us to reimagine the world. So Matt, thanks for doing this tonight, and thanks for everything you brought to the program.
Thanks, Jake. Thanks everyone for the attention that you will give to me for maybe about an hour as I share my love and struggle with these thinkers, love for and struggle with them. Jake, you spoke to the collaborative nature of some of my work. I learned that in PCC, and I couldn't ask for more brilliant colleagues, both among the faculty and all of you. I jumped at the chance to present here because it's a laboratory for thinking together, and I love to think with. I'm thinking with these two dudes tonight, and with all of you, and I really do want to save that last hour for dialogue, so I should get to it. So I'm giving another rendition of this talk on these two thinkers. I gave the first a few weeks ago at Villanova University. There was a conference on Teilhard and Whitehead, hosted by Ilya Delio, whose name came up, I think, during Ari's presentation earlier, who's a Teilhardian philosopher, and at that conference, there were, the Teilhardians and the Whiteheadians getting together to understand better the visions of these thinkers, but not just to praise them and treat them as know-it-all gurus that can do no wrong, but to really harvest what is relevant to our struggles and to be aware of the things they missed, the blind spots, and the things they got wrong, really. And so I hope to surface all of that so that we can work through it. And I want to hear about the voices of other thinkers from all of you that you care about, that you think are relevant to this conversation about science, religion, and the future of the Earth and the evolution of the Earth. So I really wanted to foreground that and draw on the ideas from these two thinkers, but the topic really at hand here is how to move forward to bring all the peoples of the earth, all the creatures of the earth together in light of what these two big ideas, science, scientific knowledge, and religion, religious inspiration. These words can mean a lot of things. Whitehead, for those of you who haven't yet had the opportunity to struggle with his texts, if you haven't heard much about him, he is a mathematician and a physicist for the first half of his career in England at Cambridge University and then in London. And then he came to the United States and he began to do metaphysics and cosmology and philosophy. His first course in philosophy was the one he taught at Harvard University in the fall of 1924. And he developed his cosmological vision without concern for the offense that it may cause to any religious orthodoxies. But still, his creative conception of the relationship between God and the world, right? He wasn't just doing cosmology, he was also doing what's come to be called process theology. His conception of this relationship between God and the world has been heartily taken up by Protestant theologians, John Cobb Jr., David Ray Griffin, many others, Charles Hartshorne, and many other traditions, Judaism, Islam, indigenous philosophers are taking up his work. Teilhard, on the other hand, was a paleontologist, so also a scientist, but he was a Jesuit priest as well. And for several reasons, but primarily I think his evolutionary revision of the doctrine of original sin was not in line with Catholic dogma, and he was censured by the church, by his fellow Jesuits. He wasn't allowed to publish during his life because of his views. And in some ways, I see an analogy here between a thinker a few centuries before Teilhard, Giordano Bruno, whose sun-centric astronomy and cosmology and his attempt to get Catholic scholastic theologians to look again at the motions of the heavens, that won him not just censure, but, and there were other causes as well, but he was burnt at the stake, right? And Teilhard's vision is sun-centric. He accepts modern astronomy and cosmology, but it's omega-centric. Teilhard's vision is not about a new center of space, but a new destiny of time and the evolution of the cosmos at what he called the omega point, right? And so he tried to get Catholic theologians to look again at history and to kind of outgrow a kind of what, in his view, was a truncated vision of the past to open up to this evolutionary convergence he saw happening in the future. And luckily for Teilhard, the Inquisition had been retired and the church was no longer practicing this burning at the stake of heretics anymore. But Teilhard's heart was really already on fire with this insight of evolution. He was inhabiting really this inferno, this creative fire that drove the cosmic process forward, and he thought religion needed to catch up with this scientific insight. So I want to offer, before I get into the details of Teilhard and Whitehead's views of science and religion, I want to say a little bit about my methodology and my aspiration in this talk. I think of myself and I strive to be a transdisciplinary researcher, and so I'm constantly trying to think between the existing disciplines. I love to collaborate with scientists, I love to collaborate with religious thinkers, and I don't think of these as irreconcilable projects or perspectives, right? I think probably I'm not alone in that, in this room. But what is speculative philosophy? Well, I will be coming at this dialogue between Teilhard and Whitehead and their ideas from a predominantly Whiteheadian perspective. I've been deeply influenced by Teilhard, but as was discussed earlier, there's a coherence to Whitehead's thought that's very attractive to me, and Teilhard's a bit more of a poet whose vision and the feeling he can convey through his words touches my heart, but when I try to think through the implications of his vision, it causes me a little bit of consternation and confusion, right? So Whitehead helps me here, but Whitehead's speculative method is an attempt to go on an adventure of thought to enlarge the dictionary. And he contrasts the speculative method of philosophy with the critical method, which is, as he puts it, a method of safety, kind of remaining in the harbor and not venturing out in the open sea to invent new ideas and new concepts that enlarge the dictionary, right? Both of these two thinkers, Teilhard and Whitehead, enlarged the dictionary. They invented a lot of new words. Teilhard's are more beautiful than Whitehead's for the most part. Whitehead has, concrescence, maybe. I like that one, but it doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. Now, obviously these two guys need to be located. They are both Europeans, both men, and there's a certain elitist idea of science that's Eurocentric, that's rooted in this sense of wanting to master nature and develop certain knowledge, and it's historically been based on this dualism between human beings and nature, or between mind and matter. Neither of these two thinkers accept that dominant approach to science that came out of modern Europe. Similarly, something that neither of these two thinkers can help us with is the need to expand science to include indigenous ways of knowing, to include folk knowledges, and to understand the ways in which knowledge can be made from many perspectives and have validity beyond just this universalist sense of one perspective to rule over all others. There's also a kind of modernist idea of religion as merely a set of beliefs, and it takes the practice dimension of it out of it, and we think, you're a Christian or you're a Jew or a Muslim or whatever religion because you believe in the right things. And I think for both of them, there's a deeper dimension to religion that puts us back into our bodies and embeds us in community and allows us to practice ritual in a formative way and see religion as more of a way of life, right? Rather than just a set of ideologies that you believe in. So Whitehead's understanding of science then is just the study of what we are aware of in perception, which for him is an attempt to overcome the bifurcation of nature, or this dualism which has characterized science in the modern West since Descartes, of course. So rather than science being predicated upon a division between primary qualities of measurable matter in motion and secondary qualities, which would be all the things that are added by the mind, the colors, the scents, and the sounds, Whitehead says, no, science is just the study of everything we are aware of in perception. The stuff we can weigh and measure, and the stuff that the poets are writing about, right? Birdsong and sunsets. The feel of the velvet is one of his favorite examples. All of that is also part of nature, and it's part of what science studies when it considers the full array of our perceptual experience. Religion, for Whitehead, has two sides to it. Usually we think of religion as a collective endeavor, something that we do together. And Whitehead agrees there's something about religion that allows us to come into social solidarity. But he also emphasizes the individual side of religion. He says religion is what an individual does with their solitariness for the purpose of transforming their character. And so religion is about the internal life. He says it's the art of the internal life and the cultivation of an inwardness that then allows us to come back into community and be in solidarity with one another in a deeper way, right? So the other methodological and ethical thing I want to lay out here is this commitment to pluralism and to a relational realism. And what does that mean? These are alternatives to me to cultural relativism. Because as we want to overcome the one perspective to rule them all, and this universalist, but actually really Eurocentric perspective of scientific knowledge, we don't want to go to the opposite extreme and say, well, knowledge is different for every culture, and really there is no world out there that we could ever expect to come into deeper contact with. It just all depends on where you happen to have been born and the language you would happen to learn. I think we can do better than that. And so here, first of all, it's in wanting to challenge the idea of cultural relativism, that doesn't mean that I would want to avoid accepting the profound plurality of lifeways that constitutes the community of beings of this planet, human and other than human. So we have to reckon with this plurality. But I think if we bring in this relational piece, we can understand how to make room for many worlds within this world, while also being able to resonate with one another's differences. Bruno Latour, who was a Whitehead-inspired and influenced sociologist and philosopher of science, he died late last year, I believe. He would contrast the relativity of truth, which is what cultural relativism would be about, with the truth of relativity, which I would say what he really means is the truth of relationality. And he means relationality both socially, in terms of how my sense of identity is constituted by my understanding of my difference from everyone else's identity, and your sense of identity is constituted by your sense of your difference. So we're dialectically entangled and bound up with one another, in other words. The German idealists would call this a dialectic of recognition, where I can't really know myself unless I feel seen and recognized by you, and vice versa, right? That's the truth of relativity, or the truth of relationality. And that's the kind of pluralism, integral pluralism that I would want to gesture towards here. Because at the end of the day, the question for me does involve an aspiration toward a planetary culture, not to replace local cultures and bioregional contact with the place that you inhabit, and the local communities within which, from day to day, you discover your sense of self and purpose in the world, and your sense of mission in collaboration with the others next to you. But I think we do also need this planetary vision. But we need to imagine the planet as a world where many other worlds fit, right? And we need to discover a way of being human that allows us to keep our uniqueness as individuals, as cultures, and that also allows us to concretely venture towards, and we're never going to arrive there, but we can venture towards it indefinitely, a sense of humanness. How can we become human together? Again and again in a new way every day, through these dialectics of recognition, learning who we are by acknowledging our differences from one another. All right, so that's part of my ethical methodology in thinking with these two philosophers. I couldn't do better at explaining what becoming indigenous and becoming Gaian means than what Elizabeth and Sarah Lisa did for us yesterday. But just briefly, 2 days ago actually, wasn't it? Yeah, 2 days ago. To be human is to be of the earth, right? We are breathing and speaking beings made of mud. And we're fellow members of a Gaian body that is energetically bound to all other life forms. So humans are not special. But stay with me. It's actually precisely the reverse. Humans are not special. We are the beings, though, who are capable of identifying with and becoming responsible for the concrete universal, the earth as a whole. We have that special responsibility. So it's precisely not that we're special, it's that we're universal, potentially. And I think Gaia, the earth process, is seeded with this potential, and it's not like for just our species that we realize this potential, it's for the earth that we realize this potential. That's what becoming Gaian would mean for me. And I'm drawing on Sean's work here and his attention to the concrete universal and how that would differ from an abstract universal, which would be what I was talking about earlier with this imposition of what's actually a Eurocentric understanding of how the human should be. So when we think about the relationship between science and religion, I think a helpful way to understand their dialectical entanglement is to think in terms of these transcendentals: truth, beauty, goodness, right? These ways of understanding, you could say that the names of God in some traditions, or just the ways that being expresses itself through these different perspectives, right? Beauty, truth, goodness. So scientific knowledge seeks the truth. Religious faith glorifies the good. Art falls in love with beauty. Politics strives for justice. These are essences that orient us. And instead of thinking of each of them as somehow separate from all of the others, it's very clear that scientists are devoted to the truth in a religious way, right? Just as in the pursuit of the good, the person of religious faith is trying to be true to the good. And beauty, of course, is very much a part of how a physicist understands which equations are more likely to reflect the underlying harmonies of the universe. Beauty is a guide and an aid to the discovery of truth for the scientist, right? And so you can see how these are all dialectically entangled. Whitehead and Teilhard are both panentheists, right? And so they understand God and the world as, again, dialectically entangled. I would almost prefer to call them, this is a clumsy word, but pangentheists, to emphasize Genesis and creation, because they're both thinkers of the process through which God and the world come into ever deeper relationship with one another. It's not just a static sense of God being in the world and the world being in God. It's a creative, ongoing process of ever deepening relationship between the two. That's Plato and Aristotle from Raphael's School of Athens, and what dialectical means, I think, was something discovered and intuited by Plato and then perfected and maybe even reified a little bit by Aristotle, or at least how he was inherited. But in the Sophist, Plato is trying to understand who the Sophist is, and in another dialogue, the Statesman, I think, he goes more into this question: what is the philosopher? But he says in the midst of the Sophist, it is in some region like this, and he means where ideas commingle in the process of dialectic and dialogue between interlocutors. It is in some region like this that we shall always, both now and hereafter, discover the philosopher. So the philosopher is always mixed up in ideas, in deep dialogue with others about what they mean. And there's no end to that process. If you claim to be wise, maybe there is an end to that process, but the philosopher does not claim to be wise. The philosopher is in love with wisdom and in pursuit of it with others through dialogue. And Aristotle says at the beginning of his Metaphysics, it is owing to wonder that human beings now and ever again begin to philosophize. Whitehead paraphrases Aristotle and says that philosophy begins in wonder, and in the end, when it has done its best, the wonder remains. Right? Whitehead wants to chime in here. Right, just to emphasize the point, according to Plato, the distinguishing mark of the philosopher in contrast to the sophist is his resolute attempt to reconcile conflicting doctrines, each with its own solid ground of support. So I want to share this quote from Teilhard, which I've checked with a few Teilhard scholars and they haven't told me he definitely didn't say it, but I can't seem to find the citation. It's all over the internet.
I can give it to you.
You know where he said this?
Yeah, I got it in a paper and I cited this.
Excellent.
Yeah.
See, I love collaborating with this team. I asked 3 Teilhard scholars and they didn't know.
Oh, really?
So Monica's got it for me.
Okay.
This is PCC to me. There's almost a sensual longing for communing with others who have a large vision, the immense fulfillment of the friendship between those engaged in furthering the evolution of consciousness has a quality impossible to describe. So on science and religion, Teilhard says, After almost 2 centuries of passionate struggle, neither science nor faith has managed to diminish the other. Quite the contrary. It becomes clear that they cannot develop normally without each other, for the simple reason that they are both animated by the same life. Whitehead says, philosophy frees itself from the taint of ineffectiveness by its close relations with religion and with science, natural and sociological. It attains its chief importance by fusing the two, namely religion and science, into one rational scheme of thought. He's always seeking coherence, right? Now, let me give you a little more context here from Whitehead. He says that science and religion, though he wants to fuse them into a rational scheme of thought, they're not doing the same thing. But he says they're different phases of individual experience. So religion, he says, is centered upon the harmony of rational thought with the sensitive reaction to the percepta from which experience originates. Science is concerned with the harmony of rational thought with the percepta themselves. So remember, science is what we are aware of in perception, the study of what we are aware of in perception, the patterns that display themselves to us, making no division or bifurcation between what can be quantified and what is qualitative, between primary and secondary characteristics. All that's out the window for Whitehead. Everything perceived is in nature, he says. And science studies the patterns we can detect, sometimes mathematical, and sometimes we're looking for forms that can't quite be mathematized because there's a living qualitative dimension to them. All that for Whitehead counts as science. But religion is looking for this harmony of rational thought with the sensitive reaction, which by sensitive reaction he also means the emotional reaction to the perceptual world. So how do we as human beings respond to this cosmos that is displayed before us? That's a religious question. What are the patterns being displayed? That's a scientific question. When science deals with emotions, or that sensitive reaction, the emotions in question are percepta and not immediate passion. So science can study religious experience. But when it's dealing with that experience, it's dealing with those emotions as perceptions and not as immediate passions, right? So other people's emotion and not our own. If we're enraptured and having an ecstatic mystical experience, we're not doing science, and that we shouldn't be. We're not reflecting on what's happening to us. It's happening to us. We are the happening. But there's still value in later stepping back and saying, what happened to me? Or asking about other people who have those experiences. What's happening? Right? So science studies other people's emotion, other people's mystical experience. Right? Or we study our own in recollection and not in immediacy. Religion deals with the formation of the experiencing subject, whereas science deals with the objects, which are the data forming the primary phase in this experience. And here he's subtly already describing this process of concrescence, which for the formation of each moment of human experience, as well as for a quantum event, the experience in any given moment of the life history of a cell, or any other animal species, maybe even a star, a galaxy. Concrescence is the process whereby these beings of different kinds are formed by inheriting objects, which for Whitehead are perished experiences in the past, that grow together to and seek out the achievement of a new subjective perspective, which is who we are in each moment, right? So the subject's not there looking around, collecting objects to add to itself. The subject in each moment grows out of all the other subjects who've just finished experiencing and creates a new perspective, a new orientation and experience of the cosmos that had never existed before, because it's growing out of everything that came before it and then adding itself to the universe to become an object inherited by the next subject. And so Whitehead's applying his theory of concrescence to the human experience of this difference between science and religion. Now, both Teilhard and Whitehead are evolutionary thinkers. Evolution is a concept that's far bigger than just Darwin's theory of natural selection. Darwin actually didn't even use the word except in the final page of the last edition of The Origin of Species. At that time, they called it transformism, and evolution had more to do with this debate among those who studied ontogeny, or the development of individual organisms, where just there, development, like evolution, means the unfolding of something enfolded. And so the debate between the theory of epigenesis and the theory of evolution was really a debate between creationists and those who thought that in each generation, a new individual organism is just made sort of from scratch, rather than the evolutionists who thought that there were actually miniature, like Russian doll versions of every species enfolded in the eggs of the female, just infinitely down. And so every being has already been created, because the idea was we want to be able to explain the emergence of new beings without God having to do creation over and over again. Creation happens once, all the beings are here already in miniature, right? Evolution referred to that view, but it gradually got adopted by the Darwinians. But Teilhard and Whitehead are trying to think beyond just Darwin's version of evolution by natural selection, even beyond just biology in general, generalizing evolution to apply to the cosmos as a whole, right? And we're very familiar in PCC with evolutionary cosmology. It's the idea that every enduring form in the universe is historically emergent. There are no fixed laws of nature even. The very laws of nature are caught up in the evolutionary process. Now the thing about Darwin is, he's a great scientist, right? And he focused, though, on the meticulous collection of particular facts and cataloging those particular facts. This is his collection of beetles. I mean, a small part of his collection of beetles. And he did this with so many other species. And he developed really a bare bones theory of speciation based on this huge number of facts. And his theory of natural selection is, I mean, the book's called Origin of Species, and it's often misconstrued as though Darwin gave us the explanation of life. He wasn't trying to do that, and he didn't do that. His theory of natural selection presupposes living organisms striving to survive. And so you give him the existence of these organisms striving to survive, and then his theory of natural selection is one mechanism that might account for this process of differentiation over the course of millions of years as habitats, environments change, and so on, and species compete with one another. But it's a partial perspective. There's a lot more going on in the evolution of organisms, and biology nowadays is fully recognizing this. Darwin also presupposed fixed laws of physics. The final page of Origin of Species includes these lines. He says, "There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed," in the final edition he adds, "by the Creator," because he didn't want to offend religious people. "There's grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms, or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved." So in the background of Darwinian biology is Newtonian physics, a universe whose order was fixed from eternity. Now, Daniel Dennett wrote a book called Darwin's Dangerous Idea in 1995. And he's a neo-Darwinian. He thinks that Darwin's theory of natural selection is a universal acid that melts through any remaining residue of teleology in the universe. He says evolution is a mindless, purposeless, algorithmic process in this book. He goes even further and says that evolutionary thinkers like Teilhard are losers because we now know through genetics, we now know that life is purposeless and that evolution it's not exactly random. What's random is the mutations which get selected by a fixed environment. But this neo-Darwinian view doesn't really leave much room for human aspirations, to put it mildly. So not only are Whitehead and Teilhard trying to generalize evolution beyond the Earth, and beyond just the biological world, to include the whole physical universe, they also want to grant organisms agency in their own evolution. Both, Teilhard has this notion of the within of things. Whitehead has this notion of the mental pole. And this is the space of decision, where individual organisms are making choices to realize certain possibilities and to avoid other possibilities. And this interior dimension of the evolutionary process is hinted at by Darwin, especially in his theory of sexual selection, where the agency of the organism begins to come through in the aesthetic choices that are being made in that process. But Whitehead and Teilhard really want to say this eros that Darwin was detecting in this one area is actually pervasive and has way more of a role to play in the forms that organisms take and the ways that organisms change and alter their environments. Organisms aren't passive victims of fixed environments. They make their environments. Whitehead points out that, this idea that somehow natural selection, whereby, through this struggle for existence, those organisms that are best fit to their environment will survive, and that all that we need to assume is that they have this desire to survive. Whitehead points out that, evolution has produced more complex organisms over the course of billions of years that are deficient in survival power relative to the earlier, simpler forms, right? So what's driving this process of complexification towards organisms that are actually more fragile? More sensitive too, but more fragile. If evolution was just about organisms becoming more survivable over time, we wouldn't expect to see this process of complexification. Whitehead says, if survival were the name of the game, it would have been much better for matter to have remained in rock form, right? Rocks are way better at surviving for billions of years than any organic form of life. So survival of the fittest cannot be the whole story. For Teilhard, evolution, he says, is a general condition to which all theories, all hypotheses, all systems must henceforth bow and satisfy if they are to be thinkable and true. Whitehead says evolution is now the guiding the methodology of all branches of science. And it follows that science is taking on a new aspect, which is neither purely physical nor purely biological. It is becoming the study of organisms. Biology is the study of the larger organisms, whereas physics is the study of the smaller organisms. So the periodic table of elements is literally a particle zoo, right? Stars and galaxies are species of organism. And here, organism means a self-organizing system. And for Whitehead, these organisms they're the product of a stream of experiences that has an interior, and for Teilhard too, that is an experiential perspective. And so what is galactic consciousness like? What is solar or any astral consciousness like? Very different from our own, but Whitehead says there's got to be something it's like to be. Teilhard says there's got to be something it's like to be organisms at all of these scales. How do we know that? From our own experience. If we can be conscious, experiential creatures with agency, that must have some basis in the rest of the cosmos, right? It didn't just come from nowhere. Whitehead argues that evolution, a thoroughgoing evolutionary philosophy, is incompatible with materialism, right? Since materialism assumes that there can be merely change that's purposeless and unprogressive, while the whole point of evolution, right, is the development of these complex organisms from antecedent states of less complex organisms. So there's an arc to evolution. There's a deepening of the capacity for experience and agency over the course of evolutionary history. And materialism can't account for that arc, that tendency. So Teilhard says that from this perspective, all cosmic energy is fundamentally psychic, right? So they're both panpsychists. And the physical energy described by science is formed by the mechanical quantum of tangential energy developed on the outermost spherical limits of things. So in Teilhard's terms, there are two types of energy. There's tangential energy, which is like mechanical energy that's subject to the laws of entropy, and it tends to sort of spread out and dissipate. And there's also radial energy, which is this movement towards unity, this movement of that the within of things guides towards convergence. It's guided by love, ultimately, right? So while there may appear to be violent collisions happening when we look at the universe in terms of its tangential energy alone, which is what science has generally studied, if we take the perspective of the within of things and look at this long arc of evolution, there's another movement happening that Teilhard is describing in terms of radial energy, and he loves to think with spheres. And so this is one of his diagrams where at each level, from the bottom, that's pre-life, that's matter, and it's mostly tangential energy at play. But then another layer is added, and as you move closer towards omega at the top of the sphere, there's a convergent motion that's occurring as new layers of complexity are added that increase the intensity of the consciousness, right? So as the radial exterior, as the tangential energy, which is the exterior of organisms, grows more complex, the radial energy, which is the centration and the interiority, grows more intense. It's the law of complexity consciousness, as Teilhard referred to it. And it's all headed towards this culminating point, which he symbolizes with the last letter of the Greek alphabet. For Whitehead, he is also a panpsychist, as I mentioned. He says, millions of years ago, our Earth began to cool off, and forms of life began in their simplest aspects. Where did they come from? They must have existed in potentiality in the most minute particles, first of this fiery and then of this watery and earthly planet. One more thing I wanted to mention from the last slide, the difference here, with Teilhard's orientation toward omega, Whitehead wouldn't necessarily describe evolution as progressive. I think he would rather describe it as ingressive. He talks about the ingression of possibilities, which shape the future, but they shape the future in a rather anarchic and unruly way. There's not this overarching telos causing all of the universe to converge, or all creatures on Earth to necessarily converge on this one point in Whitehead's philosophy, right? So rather than thinking of evolution as this progressive convergence, in Whitehead's view, evolution or cosmogenesis, it's more like a creative advance into novelty, would be his phrase, right? It's more like a fractal self-similar pluralization rather than a uniform radial convergence, as I was describing in Teilhard's view. Right, so for Whitehead, each moment of creation, each creature is individually unique while remaining universally entangled with every other. But it's an open-ended adventure that all of these creatures are on. It's an open-ended cosmic co-creation. And there's a little bit more of a sense of closure in Teilhard's vision. But they're both panpsychists, right? Consciousness and experience for both of them are not accidental additions. They're essential ingredients in all of cosmogenesis from the beginning, right? Mind matters in their cosmology. And Whitehead does have a theology, right? It's not like he is absent this sense of a lure or a teleology. He says the teleology of the universe is toward the production of beauty. But for Whitehead, beauty is the bringing into contrast of ever more diverse expressions. It's the harmonization of diverse points of view that produces more intense beauty. And that's not different from Teilhard's description of what the emergence of the noosphere as we converge on omega would look like. For Teilhard, unity differentiates, he says. And so as we move toward omega, I wouldn't think of it as a single mind and we lose our individual personalities. we become more personalized, Teilhard would say, as we converge on this omega point, right? And so you'll see it, I'll continue to wobble thinking like, oh, okay, this is the difference between the two of them. But actually, if we really understand Teilhard more deeply. Whitehead also has this profound theology. It's a conception of God of having these two poles, right? What he calls the primordial pole and the consequent pole. The alpha and the omega, right? But for Whitehead, briefly stated, the primordial pole is this sort of, I'm going to use the word archetype. There's a lot to unpack there, but it's sort of this archetypal condition or constraint upon possibility that allows each creature in its unique position in the becoming of the world to have some sense of relevant novelty amidst the infinity of possibilities available in each moment. So it's like the primordial nature of God just sets the bass note, and then the rest of the creatures that become in the context of that note or that rhythm that God has laid down at the beginning of time, let's say, creatures can then improvise on that basis. God's not determining what each creature decides to do, but God's providing the bass note upon which further improvisation can occur. And then the consequent nature of God is it's like this cosmic memory that's saying yes to every creative improvisation, even the off-key notes that are kind of like, oh, I'm not sure about that one. God somehow makes it valuable, finds the value in it, right? And so it's one God, though, and I still struggle to understand how the primordial and consequent natures of God fit together, because Whitehead says the primordial God is eternal. That bass note doesn't change. It's the same. It's the same vision of the most beautiful possibility for the universe to realize that gets recapitulated by each creature in a unique way. And the consequent nature of God's constantly growing with all of these unique contributions of each of the creatures. And so the challenge is, how do you think of changing, growing, evolving God together with this eternal archetypal vision of perfection that gets it all started? I struggle with that. But Whitehead wants to have both of these as part of his vision of God. It might be that it's beyond our finite understanding, but he definitely Whitehead has this sense of divine preservation, right, of the fruits of all of our conscious striving. So his God is both this primordial principle and this cosmic memory. You could think of it as an Akashic record, right? And there's a way in which Teilhard's omega seems different from this consequent nature of God, because the omega can very easily be, it's tempting to imagine it as an endpoint of time that we're moving towards and it's not present yet. But Teilhard's very clear that omega is with us now. Omega is with us now, that as a lure guiding us towards this culminating evolutionary emergence of a totally, so just as we've gone in the history of the universe from matter, physics, atoms and stars and galaxies, to life, living cells, to reflective self-consciousness, Teilhard thinks, okay, this is headed somewhere, and there will be just as dramatic an emergence when we reach this omega point as we've seen in the prior phases of cosmogenesis, right? And so somehow, though, this curve is already implicit in our experience now. So even while it's tempting to read Teilhard as a providential thinker, that there's this thing happening out there in the future and we're not there yet and we just have to have faith in it, it's like, no, it's here already if we have the cosmic sense that Teilhard tries to inspire in us. But here's my wobble back to a little bit of doubt here about whether Teilhard and Whitehead are that similar, because Teilhard says that there's a definite limit and term to the elementary value and to the sum total of radial energies, right? So radial energy, right, that's the within of things that's trying to converge and unify on this omega point. There's a definite limit and term to the elementary value and to the sum total of radial energies. He says this in The Human Phenomenon. Pretty clear, definite limit and term, an end point, right? So Whitehead says, he's skeptical of any final state or order, quote, beyond which there can be no progress. And he continues, this is from Process and Reality, this belief in a final order, popular in religious and philosophic thought, and he was writing in the mid-20s, so he didn't know about Teilhard, but this belief in a final order, popular in religious and philosophic thought, seems to be due to the prevalent fallacy that all types of seriality necessarily involve terminal instances. As a mathematician, you're saying that's not true. Right? So Whitehead's skeptical of the idea of a final limit and term to this evolutionary arc. So from their perspective, right, what the question that I would raise for us is what is the place of consciousness, human self-consciousness in the cosmos, and what is philosophy's role in helping us to discern it? For both of these thinkers, rather than human beings and life on Earth being exceptions to what the rest of the universe is doing, or anomalies, for both of them, human beings and life are examples of the creativity that's present in all of the processes of the cosmos, from electrons and atoms and stars and galaxies to living cells and all the other organisms on the Earth, right? So human beings are an example of, an exemplification of cosmic dynamics, not an exception to those cosmic dynamics. So then that means we can turn to our own experience to learn something about the universe without being anthropomorphic. It's the universe that shapes and shaped humans. The universe is anthropomorphic, if you want. So Whitehead has one category in his metaphysics that's meant to apply to creatures at every scale of the cosmos. And that category is the actual entity or actual occasions. The whole world, from moment to moment, is composed out of these actual occasions of experience. In his term concrescence, which I was describing earlier, the growing together of the past into a new present, the growing together of the perished subjects which have become objects. He calls them superjects as well. They grow together to form a new subject in the present, which then itself, as soon as that new perspective is achieved, it perishes and becomes objectively immortal, to be inherited by the next moment of experience. This is his description of the process of concrescence, and actual occasions are what are doing the concressing, right? And it's a category that's meant to apply across all scales. So at every scale, the universe is feeling itself. But he wants to reserve consciousness for, he would say, animals with pretty well-developed nervous systems. So he'll say experience goes all the way down, but not all experience is conscious. And that's tricky for some people to grok, but we already, as people who study depth psychology can understand that much of our experience is unconscious, right? But there's lots of centers of agency and experience in our personal and collective unconscious, doing a bunch of stuff all the time, and our ego is not aware of it, right? And so when you think of what is meant by the idea of non-conscious experience, that might be a helpful point of translation. So our self-consciousness, though, as a result of the ways that our nervous system is so complexly organized, it can make us feel separate from the universe. Self-consciousness is a very late phase in the process of concrescence that constitutes a human experience. And it has all these earlier phases that we're usually not conscious of. Artists train to become way more conscious of a certain phase of their experience than we're normally attuned to. Whether you're a musician or you're a painter, you're trying to perceive tone or color in a way that very often gets processed below our level of awareness. And so we can, by cultivating our attention, deepen our experience below the level of self-consciousness. But self-consciousness makes us feel separate, right? And what Whitehead thinks philosophy is for is to help us recover these deeper layers of experience whereby we feel our continuity with the rest of the world. So he says, philosophy is the self-correction by consciousness of its own initial excess of subjectivity. Each actual occasion contributes to the circumstances of its origin, additional formative elements deepening its own peculiar individuality. So part of these phases of concrescence that build up to each moment of our self-consciousness includes the ingression of new possibilities that weren't present in the past that we're inheriting. And very complex animals with nervous systems and human beings in particular are adept at ingressing these novel possibilities that as we emerge into self-consciousness in each moment really do give us the sense of separation from the universe out of which we're arising. But Whitehead says that consciousness is only the last and greatest of such elements by which the selective character of the individual obscures the external totality from which it originates and which it embodies. An actual individual of such higher grade has struck with the totality of things by reason of its sheer actuality. But it has attained its individual depth of being by a selective emphasis limited to its own purposes. The task of philosophy is to recover the totality obscured by the selection. So philosophy for Whitehead is this process of excavating these earlier phases of experience. And it can be a little nerve-wracking to let go of the self-conscious center of egohood, to do that sort of splunking, right, deep in the cave of experience. But Whitehead thinks that's the whole method of philosophy, in particular speculative philosophy. So Whitehead's philosophy and understanding of the process of philosophizing and cosmologizing is an attempt to help us remember where we came from and where we come from moment by moment. But what of the future? So Teilhard sees the emergence of the human being and human self-consciousness as a divine sign of what's to come, right? So he says, this is another one of his diagrams, looking at the history of hominids, where there was this fanning out at earlier phases into various species of the Homo genus. But as we got to the Neolithic and then to the present, where there's still a lot of differentiation on the human planet. I mean, we're dealing with some pretty serious wars right now as a result of that. But Teilhard's confident that we've begun the convergence process as a species. He says, if we lack these qualities of sight, no matter what anyone does to show us, the human being will indefinitely remain for us, what still is true for many minds, an erratic object in a disconnected world. But on the contrary, once the triple illusion of smallness, plurality, and immobility has vanished from our eyes, then the human being will effortlessly assume the central place we have just proclaimed, with the human as the momentary summit of an anthropogenesis, which itself crowns a cosmogenesis. We humans cannot see ourselves completely except as part of humanity, humanity as part of life, and life as part of the universe. From this stems the fundamental plan of my work: pre-life, life, and thought, three events that outline in the past and command for the future super life. One, same, single trajectory, the curve of the human phenomenon. So he is an anthropocentric thinker, but he's also saying the human being, kind of like Nietzsche, is a phase in the evolutionary process that we will pass through. The human is not the destination, but it is the channel through which evolution must go to reach the next phase. And so he's anthropocentric in that way. And here I want to mention what's occurred since Teilhard died in 1955, so the last 60, 70 years. There have been major pockets within the church, particularly among Jesuits, that Teilhard has influenced positively. Pope Francis, in his encyclical and in his most recent letter, is carrying forward, I think, part of the spirit of Teilhard's work. Not explicitly very much, but the spirit of it is there. And the Pope Francis calls for what he refers to as a situated anthropocentrism. He can't give up the idea that the human is the glory of creation, right? But he wants to situate the human being in the context of the community of life on earth. So he says, this is a quote from Laudato Si, he says, "The Judeo-Christian vision of the cosmos defends the unique and central value of the human being amid the marvelous concert of all God's creatures. But today we see ourselves forced to realize that it is only possible to sustain a situated anthropocentrism. To recognize, in other words, that human life is incomprehensible and unsustainable without other creatures. For as part of the universe, all of us are linked by unseen bonds and together form a kind of universal family, a sublime communion which fills us with a sacred, affectionate, and humble respect." Francis wrote another letter called Laudate Deum just last week. And I'll read a quote from that. He says, "God has united us to all his creatures. Nonetheless, the technocratic paradigm can isolate us from the world that surrounds us and deceive us by making us forget that the entire world is a, quote, contact zone." Contact zone is a phrase that the Pope borrows from and cites from the work of Donna Haraway, which I think might be the first woman or among the first women quoted in any papal letter. Is that accurate? That's accurate. So the first woman quoted by a pope is an atheist. I mean, she was raised Irish Catholic, and she has expressed her anti-Catholic position, but she's also said, she says, "My ability to separate the figural and the literal comes straight out of my inability to separate the figural and the literal comes straight out of a Catholic relationship to the Eucharist. I have a very Catholic sensibility as a theorist, even though I am opposed to Catholicism. Right? So she acknowledges the way that, she thinks always in terms of the material semiotic actor, and this with a hyphen between material and semiotic, this inseparability, right, of the literal and the figural for her, she says, is a function of her embeddedness in this ritual practice as a child of communion, Mass, Eucharist.
First living woman.
The first living woman. Yeah. First living woman, thank you. I was among, and I saw, our one of our alums, and he teaches at the University of San Francisco, which is a Catholic school, Jesuit school, Sam Mickey. And I both discovered this right around the same moment, and we're reaching out to each other to say did you see that? Am I making this up? It's just mind-blowing. So this is just to say that despite the fact that I think the church is an institution with a deeply troubling history and present, it is trying to shift, and Teilhard is part of that internal transformation that's trying to occur. I don't know if they can pull it off. There's a lot of internal discord and resistance to the Pope and to Teilhard's views still, but I think this is a sign of a possible transformation that may occur. Because there are, 1 billion Catholics. I think it's important for that religion to adopt an earth-friendly worldview. Now, problematic parts of Teilhard. In 1946, he wrote this essay titled "Some Reflections on the Spiritual Repercussions of the Atom Bomb." He was so enraptured by this vision of cosmic curvature towards Omega, and so certain, he had such deep faith that this would occur no matter what, that I think it made him a little bit blind to the ravages of industrial technology, the ecocidal dynamics of the growth of capitalist economies and techno-capitalist economies, and it also blinded him to the dangers of eugenics. He was in support of what he called humane eugenics. Not sure what that looks like, but he writes about the atom bomb. The thing had happened. For the first time on Earth, an atomic fire had burned for the space of a second, industriously kindled by the science of man. But having thus realized his dream of creating a new thunderclap, man, stunned by his success, looked inward and sought by the glare of the lightning his own hand had loosed to understand its effect upon himself. His body was safe, but what had happened to his soul? But in this essay, Teilhard celebrates the ingenuity involved and says, look, if we can harness the power of the atom, we should not think of the human being as in some way limited by entropy or in some way subject to the decay of the material world. For Teilhard, that the atom bomb was yet another piece of evidence to suggest that we were converging on the transformation not just of matter into life and not just of life into mind, but mind into Omega. Mind into, well, for him, as a Jesuit, Christ, Christogenesis. That's the destiny of the human, which is this being of love. But it's very easy to say, wow, Teilhard, you just don't get the suffering that was involved in this process of more technology and more convergence of people and all the war. No, he was a stretcher bearer on the front lines of 80 battles in World War II. He saw hundreds of people die. He wasn't blind to the suffering, and he still had this perspective. As a stretcher bearer, he saw the horrors of war firsthand, and some of his writing from the front lines is among his most beautiful and hopeful about this process of Christogenesis. War for Teilhard could only accelerate the process of convergence. So he wasn't unaware of the death and the suffering and the pain of war, but all of that suffering he thought was just really hastening new Genesis, Christogenesis. So this is the part of Teilhard that I really struggle with. Okay, moving towards closure here with a few questions. We talked about artificial intelligence the other night. It's on everybody's minds. Many commentators are currently comparing the danger of AI, particularly this idea of artificial general intelligence. They're comparing it to the threat posed by nuclear weapons, and not as separate threats. The idea is that AI could harness the nuclear weapons and many other things to really bring a lot of destruction to the planet. And there are various scenarios that smart people have played out here about what AI could do to end the human project. But I want to reiterate something Leo said the other day, where he said, if we feel like we are separate from nature, we're more likely to destroy it. If we feel like we are separate from technology, we're more likely to use it, paraphrasing, in dehumanizing and ecocidal ways. And like I said during the faculty panel on AI, I really don't think human beings have ever been separate from their tools, their technologies. The way we think, the way we move, our very embodied form is a function of how we have related to our tools over millions of years. So we're not separate from these technologies. And so the question is really, what's artificial? Has our intelligence ever been separate from these tools that we're using and that are using us? But we can ask a deeper question about intelligence. Why is the universe itself intelligible? When we construe it, these new technologies, as the potential emergence of artificial intelligence, the assumption is, well, natural intelligence, well, that's what human beings have, but where do human beings get it? And the deeper question here is, why is the universe itself intelligible? What does that say about the place of intelligence in the cosmos? And I think whether we're talking about the conditions for the possibility of natural science, that we can make sense of these cosmic patterns, or we're talking about the conditions for the possibility of astrology. It's clear that the universe is not just intelligible, it is intelligent. It is an expression of intelligence. But it's not an intelligence imposed from without. It's an intelligence that grows from within and is constantly engaged in a process of learning. So I don't know about this natural-artificial divide. Because before AI was even a glimmer in our imaginations, we might already have been predisposed to think of intelligence, human intelligence, as artificial because, well, nature's not intelligent. And so we don't want to think of intelligence as artificial, whether it's the machine or the human. It's always natural, which doesn't excuse any particular use of technology, but how can we integrate technology so that it enhances the quality of human life and all life on the planet? I think we can do that, and Teilhard helps us do that, right? So there is intelligence in the cosmos. There is intelligence in life, in the organization of cells. I mean, my God, the complexity of the trillions of little lives that compose our life is astounding. Each cell making complex decisions from moment to moment that allow us to continue to be conscious and digest our food and breathe the air. It's amazing. Right? And so how can we think of intelligence on a continuum? And server farms do use up a lot of energy and produce a lot of carbon emissions. And there's a way of interpreting Teilhard that's been taken up by some transhumanists that suggests that this process of technological evolution is going to produce a kind of mind that will replace the human being, and that's where evolution is headed. I don't think that was Teilhard's vision, but the transhumanists are appropriating Teilhard to give a kind of spiritual patina to that vision, to spray some Teilhardian perfume on it and say, isn't this nice? I think we need continuity. We need to understand the continuity between humans and technology, but not to replace humans, but to allow us to facilitate and to free up that radial energy, right? Remember, as radial energy becomes more interior and more capable of love, the tangential exterior becomes more complex, right? And so it may be that we will kind of continue to enter into ever deeper entanglements with machines. But if we do so in a love-centered and guided way, perhaps that entanglement and that complexification of the exterior can actually support and cradle a deepening interiority, creativity, and compassion. It might not seem like there's much evidence for that right now when you look at the effects of the internet and social media on human beings, but maybe we need to give it time. I mean, I struggle with Teilhard's vision of the way that even war can accelerate this process of new genesis. I don't want to accept that as true, but I do think there's a way in which taking a longer view of the struggles we're engaged in, that we could come out the other side of this more sensitive to one another. I don't yet see the light at the end of the social media tunnel, but it could be that we get so torn up by it that we decide that that's not the way to communicate anymore, and we turn that off and discover a new way of being in touch with each other. These are questions, right? This is the question phase of my talk as we close up here. I want to just direct your attention to this thinker, Michael Levin. He's a biologist I brought up in conversation. He's trying to think about this continuity of intelligence from the simplest living organisms up to the most complex, but also a continuity of intelligence even with machines. I had a conversation with him a few weeks ago on this called Taming the Technological Dragon. I also want to recommend a book, a contemporary writer, James Bridle, who's calling for a technological ecology, which for him is the reintegration of advanced human craft with the nature it sprung from, as he puts it in his book, Ways of Being. And he asked the question, because of the application of AI right now, predominantly driven by corporations, AI is being used to develop more efficient extractive algorithms to increase the profits of oil companies, for example. Google's providing, Microsoft's providing AI technologies for this purpose to the oil giants. And so he asked the question, are humans really intelligent? Would we do that? Apply this advanced technology to extract every last drop of oil from the ground to release it into the atmosphere? That's not a very intelligent thing to do. So I recommend his book. Now, from a strictly geophysical and biological point of view, what is the future of the Earth, right? If we just take contemporary science's point of view on this, what can we look forward to? Well, this paper came out just a few weeks ago. We all have probably heard that the sun's going to explode in 4 or 5 billion years, and that's going to wipe out any life remaining on the Earth, right? But scientists have moved the clock up on that significantly because of plate tectonics. A new super continent will form in about 250 million years that will cause volcanism, that will release so much carbon and methane in the atmosphere that the planet will become uninhabitable, right? So they write in this paper titled Climate Extremes Likely to Drive Land Mammal Extinction During Next Supercontinent Assembly. They write, all life will eventually perish in a runaway greenhouse once absorbed solar radiation exceeds the emission of thermal radiation in several billion years. However, conditions rendering the Earth naturally inhospitable to mammals may develop sooner because of long-term processes linked to plate tectonics. So if what's really real is just matter, and life is sort of just a excretion, on the surface of the planet, that's not a fundamental transformation or phase transition in cosmic evolution. And if mind is just an even more ephemeral kind of epiphenomenon, this is our destiny. We are destined to die with the biosphere in a few 100 million years. Now, from Whitehead's point of view, it's a comfy armchair, isn't it? I want to point out, though, it has wheels, right? So he's a process thinker, and he can scoot around on that thing. So it is a mobile armchair. But from his point of view, unfortunately, he says, our knowledge of scientific laws is woefully defective, and our knowledge of the relevant facts of the present and the past is scanty in the extreme. Thus, as the result of all our science, we are ignorant of that remote epoch when there will be a second collision between the sun and a passing star. We are ignorant of the future of life on the earth. We are ignorant of the future of mankind. We are ignorant of the course of history a year hence. We are ignorant of most of the domestic details of our lives tomorrow. We are even ignorant of the term that has been set to our own existence. There's a lot of humility in Whitehead's sense of the contours of the future. Which means there's a lot of creative possibilities. What about Teilhard? Writings in time of war, while he was a stretcher bearer, daily laying to rest his fellow Frenchmen. He couldn't take up a gun as a Jesuit, but he was a stretcher bearer and tried to help these thousands of soldiers pass on, right? He says, it is not enough for us to throw off our self-love and live as a social being. We need to live with our whole heart in union with the totality of the world that carries us along, cosmically, deeper than the soul of individuals, vaster than the human group. There is a vital fluid or spirit of things. There is some absolute that draws us and yet lies hidden. If we are to see its features, to answer its call and understand its meaning, and if we are to learn to live more, we must plunge boldly into the vast current of things and see whither its flow is carrying us. He adds in another text, the Divine Milieu, he says, you may multiply the extent and duration of progress as much as you please, and you may promise the world another 100 million years of growth. But if at the end of all that time it appears that the whole of consciousness must revert to zero, without its hidden essence being anywhere preserved, then we shall lay down our arms and there will be a complete cessation of effort. The day is not far distant when humanity will realize that biologically it is faced with a choice between suicide and adoration. So for Teilhard, this vision of the future is very important psychologically, as a motivator. He was worried that as technology advanced and consumer society gave some classes of people so much leisure, that we were going to grow bored without a vision of the future.
Not just bored.
And he's trying to offer that vision. And it has blind spots. And it has features which I struggle with. And I hope you can help me struggle with. But Teilhard and Whitehead, they offer an invitation that I think is essential. If not in the details of precisely what their vision is offering, then this general sense that we need to become integral to the earth and imagine a future for ourselves and for the rest of the community of life that is beautiful and good and true and worth participating in. We need this worldview, we need this cosmology. Or suicide. Right? And so adoration for Teilhard is this love of evolution, this love of participation and collaboration. And without that positive vision, he's very worried for us, and in the short term, right? Because what are the alternative truncated visions? Nationalism, racism, etc. Individualism, consumerism. We can't live without some sense of purpose, and we have all these surrogate forms of it lying around. distracting us from the purpose of cosmogenesis, biogenesis, anthropogenesis, amorization. Christogenesis is obviously kind of Christocentric, but amorization of the earth. Just think of it in terms of the deepening interiorization and opening of human hearts, right, as we move deeper into communion with one another. So, but part of their invitation is that we can consider our own moment as a moment of Genesis. We can consider every moment as a moment of Genesis, right? Cosmic creation is not a once and done event. It's ongoing. We inhabit a cosmogenesis, right? So every decision that we make is a contribution to or a derogation from that process. Even with Teilhard's confidence in the coming of Omega, he did admit the possibility of failure in some of his writings. But this motivating vision is an invitation to consider that with every thought, with every deed, with every feeling that we feed, that we're building the earth. And it's an invitation to recognize the unique potentials of the human being in the midst of a zeitgeist right now, particularly among academics who are responding to the ecological crisis, that really wants to deflate and decenter the human being. And I understand that I agree with and participate in that, because there is a certain kind of anthropocentrism that's not situated at all, and that imagines the human being is just large and in charge, and that the earth just exists for us to exploit and consume. That kind of anthropocentrism needs to be deflated and decentered. But I think there are other forms of human dignity that we can realize, because the danger is that in rushing to avoid anthropocentrism of any kind, the danger is that we cede our responsibility and the power that we have. And we end up actually forsaking the earth, because it may be that Gaia needs our humanity to realize what is good and true and beautiful. And that part of this planetary process involves the human being, and that the next stage of metamorphosis in this multiphasic process needs the human being to realize its potential. That the earth may not be able to become whole without us. So that we do have an essential role to play. That's what Teilhard and Whitehead suggest. I believe that, despite the way that I struggle with various facets of their thought, and I know and want to do better, to see the blind spots. And I need your help to do that, and that's what we're going to do next. So thank you for your attention.
Do you want to take a seat and I'll wander around and hand mics to people?
Sounds great.
All right.
I think I'm really expected in some sense. I mean, that was really beautiful, and I loved everything you had to say, and I love to see that you're expressing all this about Teilhard. And in some sense, I think you knew that I was going to respond to you and tell you something about what you said about some of those misgivings that you had about Teilhard. And I just need to point out that when he was there on the front, he didn't cause that war. It isn't just that he didn't take up arms because he couldn't take up arms as a Jesuit. I don't believe he would have taken up the arms.
I agree, yeah.
But he provided comfort, and he didn't have to be there at all. But he provided comfort to all the dying men, and in that all, he managed to have this incredible faith in the future. And because he felt a future pressing in, and his writings from the front are among his most powerful. And he felt himself at the front of this wave of humanity that was working its way into greater convergence, and then the whole thing about the energy. It's like that was such an incredible about the atomic bomb. It's like he didn't see the dangerousness, the horrible destruction, but what he saw was our ability to harness that power. And if we could harness power like that, then he was imagining that we could also harness the power of fire, of love, and he imagined the fire of love between us that we were harnessing. The famous quote that we shall harness we will invent gravity for a second time, harness the power of fire, or I can't remember how
it's a beautiful quote that I won't try to repeat either. But
yeah, I'm sorry, but it's like the most gorgeous quote. So, given the time that he's in, he has a vision that it is being misappropriated by the transhumanists. So they've actually written letters that, like Sam Mickey has responded to and everything, that have described the ways that they're just misappropriating it to put the perfume, just as you say. But they're missing the deepest significance of this incredible vision that's founded in Bergson, and it's about this time-developing universe that we have just discovered, and he felt those fires, and I really do believe, that this is a vision that is going to take a transformative effect all over, eventually into a whole new structure of experience for humans, and that, so I have to defend him in his time, and I'd like to talk more about this.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, he certainly was not pro-war. I hope I didn't give that impression.
And not insensitive.
It's just that war didn't increase his doubt, that it didn't give him any doubts that Omega would be realized. Right? He was able on the front lines to write cosmic poetry and profess his faith in this trajectory towards a better future, even while he was comforting these dying soldiers, fighting in a war for what?
Maybe that speaks to the power of the vision.
Yeah, thank you.
Watching it.
Thanks, Matt, for that. So I'll go ahead and make the metaphysical claim about consciousness, and you probably agree. And that's that, our form of consciousness on the sort of panpsychic spectrum has been gifted to us by the universe because it existed in potentiality. And then it, came to fruition for actualization, through our evolution steeped in that deep time. So, if you're all in on that metaphysical thing, what about our spiritual impulses, and maybe even religious impulses, and our conscious awareness of that and the desire to cultivate those contacts because we feel the value in that? Perhaps that's also rooted in reality of actualization in the same way, also through our evolution steeped in deep time. And so I feel like, that's a completely appropriate role of philosophy to further articulate that as a vision for the future. I think that's probably really consistent with Teilhard and Whitehead. Just curious to see what you think about that.
Well, for Teilhard and for Whitehead, religion should be rooted in this cosmic sense rather than in some otherworldly heaven, right? And so, Whitehead says at one point, is this still working? Am I battery dead? Test. I'll just speak up, okay? Whitehead says one of the other ways that he tries to define religion is he says religion is world loyalty, cosmic loyalty. And so in each moment of our experience, we're inheriting the entirety of the cosmic past. By the way, I won't use the 13.8 billion year mark because I think it's unlikely to be correct, given it's in the neighborhood, but it could be twice as, we could be living in a continuous creation.
What's a few years?
Yeah, and that would be another difference between Teilhard and Whitehead. I think Whitehead would be his cosmology is very much compatible with the idea of a continuous creation. There was no point in time when the universe began. There are various cosmic epochs, he would say, but there's a past and there's an evolutionary process. And while science is studying our perception of the patterns that characterize that movement of time, religion is an attempt to harmonize our thoughts about that pattern with the emotion it elicits in us. So that the emotion is this depth of feeling that is interfused throughout the whole process, but growing ever more intense, right? Through this law of complexity consciousness. So the universe is in the business of creating organisms which can amplify that past so as to intensify the emotion and the beauty that we can feel. And religion is the celebration of that beauty, and the attempt, and philosophy is the attempt to harmonize the feeling and celebration of that beauty and goodness and love with our understanding of the patterns at play that create it. Right? And so the religious response is just the other side of the coin to the scientific understanding. So they need each other. Hey, Tom.
Yeah, I was thinking that the people that you least expect to be interested in what's going to happen to the Earth's tectonic plates in 30 years' time would be Christians. Or at least members of the Abrahamic tradition, because in that tradition there is a culminating point and it's not ecological collapse.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the reasons why climate crisis isn't taken seriously by so many people. In Teilhard, you seem to see some kind of taking of that idea of the Day of Judgment and alchemizing it into the immediate point.
Mm-hmm.
But I was just struggling to reconcile the immediate point with what he's saying about what happens to the Earth in a few billion years.
Yeah. There's continuity in Whitehead's or in Teilhard's understanding of evolution until Omega, where he thinks space and time, there's some emergence that's so transformative that it somehow escapes the balance of space and time and the entropic aspect of the physical, so that some immortality can be achieved.
Not necessarily. It's another transformation of which we cannot foresee what it would be like. For a eukaryotic cell to imagine what life would be is impossible. It's impossible for us to imagine.
It's at least beyond our current understanding of space-time, matter, energy.
Yes, which is consistent with Whitehead. A different epic.
Maybe.
Yeah.
That's a longer conversation.
It's the end of the world at the Omega point.
Yeah. Teilhard is still a thinker of providence, whereas Whitehead is a thinker of a particular providence for each creature. Right? And so Whitehead's a little bit more pluralistic about the dispensation of creativity, that it's not necessarily curving towards one convergent point, but it is ramifying in a more anarchic way. So that's a tension that differentiates the two of them. I like your use of the word alchemize, Tom, though, because Teilhard is a profoundly alchemical thinker. Right? So that's the right connection to draw.
So I'm scooting around the room like Whitehead for the so that we don't get too squamped. Can I see hands again? So I've marked a number of hands at the beginning.
We've got plenty of time. So.
Yeah.
Okay, so first I really appreciated that Monica brought up that quote, that when people discover the power of love, and for the second time in the history of the earth, we will have discovered the power of fire. Yeah. And I felt like at the end of the presentation, whatever power Matt had within him came through him, even though he was obviously vulnerable about his concerns and his doubts, somehow I felt like these leadership qualities and guidance for all of us come through him. Whether that was unconscious or planned, I don't know, but it was felt. Me and Daria were actually stunned here. Right? So, and so my question is then jumping to Whitehead. You said that Whitehead wants to excavate these non-conscious aspects. And I'm wondering, how can we excavate them? What does that mean exactly? Without them becoming conscious themselves. Because how can we bring conscious attention to anything that's unconscious without it becoming conscious? So what does that mean, excavating?
That's a great question. I mean, in the effort to excavate non-conscious experience, we're shining a light of consciousness upon it, and there's like a quantum observer effect, right? We're changing what we're observing, but we're also being changed by what we're observing, right? So our consciousness is changed as we do this excavation work because we're becoming more cosmic beings. We're correcting for the initial excess of subjectivity, as Whitehead put it, to remember in a real, it's like a kind of like Platonic anamnesis, but instead of remembering something eternal and outside the world, outside the cosmos, we're remembering the deep past. And that changes our consciousness just as we change and transmute these deeper layers of experience that we try to observe, right? And so there's a mutual transformation in the process. Our consciousness isn't the same, and the experience isn't the same, right? So that's an alchemical process, right? And so we evolve to the next phase of Earth evolution by doing this excavation work, right? And because we are changed by it, and anthropogenesis is a process. The anthropos is not a destination; it's a process. And I think we're being called to recover what our heightened, brilliant self-consciousness, brilliant in the sense that it's like a spotlight, and we get fixated on our abstractions. That's transformed the earth. That's brought us into the Anthropocene. We need to. It's not so much a matter of dimming the brilliance as broadening it to recognize the other forms of intelligence all around that have been contributing to what we thought was just ours, right? So we can recover what's always been there contributing to what we think makes us so special, but be changed in the process to become like Gaians instead of thinking of ourselves as some kind of special exception to what the rest of the earth and the universe is doing. Yeah. But it's a very good point and a great question, and I hope that helps. Right.
I wrote down notes in my phone, so I wasn't incoherent mess. So, we talked a little bit about Teilhard with regards to his relationship with the suffering of the world, essentially, I think, on Monica's question, basically. So I kind of wanted to maybe give a prompt in sort of the question of theodicy for Whitehead.
Oh, yeah.
Essentially, because, we're talking about a lot of, cosmic curvature, universal moral arcs, and, they don't always tend toward justice of their own volition. History is a cracked and tragic mess of carnage and doesn't go by straight lines. So experience is highly contingent. So with this idea of a lure towards complex harmony and a capital B beauty, how do you reconcile that with, Josh went somewhere, but fuckness, across millions and billions of years?
So both Whitehead and Teilhard have a theodicy that's rooted in the idea that divine creativity is evolutionary, which is to say God is not omnipotent in the sense that God competes tit for tat with finite entities in a battle of force. And so God can't intervene and stop bad things from happening because God is part of the process as a creative impetus. And to allow for a creative universe, you're granting individual creatures the freedom to make decisions from moment to moment. And while the divine is there to try to lure, to offer the most beautiful possibility to each creature, God can't determine that the creatures that we will decide to do what's most beautiful. And that's the cost of creativity. I mean, evolution, whether we're talking about biological or the more general sense of evolution of the whole cosmos, it's full of death and destruction and cataclysm, to use Brian Swim's word. And there's no way to diminish or skirt that or pretend like that isn't something that I continue to struggle with. But there's a way of reconciling ourselves to it where we see the paradox of creativity as one wherein not all creative efforts succeed, and that when they do succeed, that beauty is profound, and we have this intense emotional response to it because of how fragile it is, and because we know it could have been otherwise. Like, the deepest form of love that human beings can experience, I think, is it's not contingent on that person who we love being alive. Like, we can love beyond the grave. And so there's an element, I mean, Whitehead says the highest form of beauty is tragedy, ultimately. Because we can't prevent loss, but we can respond to it by deepening our love for the fragile achievements of beauty that are still there. And, Whitehead says evil is creativity in the wrong season. Evil is an individual trying to do something new that disturbs the social habits around it and might even wreck the society in which it emerges. But very often, the emergence of this creativity in the wrong season, it's perceived by evil by its society, but it provokes a response from the society which disturbs the settled habits and customs that have been determining that society's behavior, and it, in some cases, catalyzes creative response that leads to a more beautiful way of being together, right, in response to this disturbance. And that seems to be, on a metaphysical level and a theological level, one way of reconciling the evolutionary process to our need for some kind of vision of the good and the beautiful and the true. Like, yes, there's destruction. Yes, there's loss and death. But that negative side of the process is what makes the achievement of these positive forms so much more valuable to us, right? It's not a given that we will succeed. But it's this theodicy is one of the sources of deep theological resistance among more traditional believers to process theology or to evolutionary theism, theistic evolution. They really want to resist this because they need a God who can intervene and make everything okay. There's nothing like that in either of these thinkers.
I'm making my way over here, but let's see those hands again so I can see who's got questions. Okay.
So good.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I mean, it's really thought-provoking, and I guess I'll have to admit that I'm still struggling with how we can become Gaia, which I think is fundamental to our survival. And Teilhard's Omega point, I don't see how those two things reconcile. And I agree with you that, and I sense that bringing the bright light of self-reflective conscious awareness on various things changes it. But I intuitively feel that it is the becoming Gaia part is us bringing forward the intuition more than the self-reflective consciousness that actually is what links up, and that we've got to prioritize that more in becoming Gaia, and that's the balance that we need to find between it's not that bright spotlight of self-reflective consciousness that, I mean, we can do wonderful things with it, but we can also do some hellacious, destructive things with it, right? And we've got to find the balance. And so, I guess, and it's been a while since I've read Teilhard's piece, but I see Whitehead providing the coherent tools to allow us through the process relational ingress of everything to ingress more of that intuitive piece into becoming Gaia. I don't see that with the Omega point. I see that more as that sort of self-grandizing. I know you spent some time with, the type of anthropocentrism, but help me reconcile those two things, because I'm not sure how those two things can coexist. And I'm scared, literally, that that sort of human superiority allows us to continue to unleash the self-reflective tools that we're doing, i.e. AI and everything, to where you could have AI grab hold of nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I feel like we've made some progress
Yeah.
to back those off a little bit, but I feel like now we're getting close again to where we could play that all out. And that's that, I don't think that's the intuitive part of us won't let that happen. The self-reflective part I can see very much allowing that.
I don't know that I can help you with that. I struggle with that too. I think Teilhard needs to be amended by Thomas Berry, who wrote an article, a chapter called Teilhard in an Ecological Age. We're acknowledging that the Teilhardian vision, there's a reason the transhumanists who are religiously committed to a kind of technological evolution have taken up Teilhard's thought, because their view is that, look, we don't need the biosphere because we'll produce technology, we'll have fusion energy, and we'll be able to produce our food, we'll grow our food in the lab, and we don't need the biosphere anymore, because the noosphere will be self-sustaining and self-sufficient. And Teilhard's not consistent on this question. Whitehead says in his Harvard lectures, his student notes record him saying about Bergson that, he's inconsistent across his various texts. And so Whitehead says you can never be quite sure what he means. But the virtue of that is that Bergson is unafraid to express what he feels and sees, even if he can't be consistent in it at the level of the metaphysics. And that might be a controversial statement, but Whitehead was very coherent and took the feelings and the vision of thinkers like Bergson and tried to make it more systematic. And I think you could say the same thing about Teilhard. He's not as consistent, and he's a very poetic thinker, though, who is able to deliver this vision at the level that's compelling to me, at the level of feeling and willing, in the sense of the faith he has in the future. But at the level of thinking, I'm a Whiteheadian, and I have all sorts of questions. And I'm uncomfortable with the seeming determinism of this arc of Omega, and the way in which it allows the end to justify the means in a way, right? And Teilhard acknowledges this and is more circumspect and careful and doesn't view it as a necessary convergence in some of his writing, but the overall thrust of it is more deterministic than I'm comfortable with. All right.
Thank you so much for the talk. It was very eye-opening. I have a question. It's quite in line with the previous question. So I'm wondering what particular thoughts, visions, maybe other thinkers help you feel out that line between, I'm going to say for lack of better terms, embracing transhumanism and maybe focusing our attention more into developing maybe a guide or a more naturally embodied relationship with the
With form, you said?
Form,
yeah.
Physicality. I definitely, for me, with the whole AI conversation as well, and looking into the future and digesting what you shared today and in the AI panel, I find myself definitely feeling this allure of the allure of just kind of embracing the transhumanism or embracing this technology as just part of the physical form of creation that is not separate from our body. And at the same time, I'm grasping for this way to find a boundary of, when it stops being okay or when it stops being natural. And for me, I've been checking in a lot with my body or feeling into how does that go to my soul. But I'm still grasping for some kind of external, red flags. So I'm just curious, what have those been for you, and how do you feel about your line? Have you been able to feel it out, and what helped you?
Well, I mean, the dominant technological paradigm now is this rush to master and control nature, as if we were separate from it. And the rush to master and control nature ends up being a rush to master and control our own human nature too. And so if that urge for mastery, and there's also this, the anthropologist, philosopher, Ernest Becker wrote a book called The Denial of Death. And this death denial is driving a lot of the dominant technological paradigm right now. I mean, what's driving the transhumanists? I mean, Ray Kurzweil wants to live forever. Death is not an accidental part of life. It's essential to life. There's no evolution without death. And so to strive to eliminate it, I feel, is a bit of a one-sided fool's errand. You end up creating more of it. Right? And so there's a certain kind of technological determinism that's driven by a certain corporate capitalist mentality that's the wrong kind of application of this technical mastery. And so I think we need to be very circumspect and suspicious of the introduction of new technologies and the claim that those technologies represent some kind of advance. In my lifetime, I've been wowed by the sorts of technologies that have come online, but I've also already noticed the way that the upgrades and the 2.0, 3.0, 4.0s, they're not actually better. They're not better. And like, what? Each new model of whatever, iPhone or this or that is being driven by a profit calculus, not driven by how can we manage limited resources to produce an advanced thing that will last a long time, and people won't need to buy the new model every year because the old model still works just fine. So the incentives are all wrong. And my hope is that as we recognize the severity of the ecological crisis, and that it's not just a change in the sort of energy we use, but it's a change in our sense of identity as human beings in relationship to the planet and the cosmos, that we can begin to change the incentive structure of technological evolution to bring it more in accord with what would serve life. Right? So I wouldn't rush headlong into adopting the transhumanist worldview and to uncritically merging ourselves with the kind of machines that are on offer right now. But I also wouldn't just reject it and say no. That's not really feasible. right? So the question isn't yes or no to technology, it's how. And we haven't been doing it in the way that I would like to see, in the way that I think a Whiteheadian or Teilhardian even worldview would suggest. And so we can't but participate or we'll get left behind, but we need to do so critically and try to steer things away from the corporate capitalist model of technological evolution in order to harvest more resources and extraction of energy from the earth, and to extract and expropriate more labor from human beings, even as we're supposed to be creating robots to do so we can do less labor. We're somehow also being roped into doing more work for these corporations. And so, yeah, we should be skeptical of the mode of technology while not giving up hope that we could engage in a different way by changing the worldview. Hopefully that's helpful. But I struggle with all of these questions myself. So.
Now you have one or two more questions?
Oh yeah.
Hey, thanks, Matt.
Yeah.
My question is about Bergson and two sources of morality and religion, which came out in 1932, I believe. And so I don't know if either Whitehead or Teilhard respond to that book, or I don't think Bergson's responding to either of them. I'm wondering just about that lineage, because obviously they're both kind of descendants of Bergson in some way, but he also waited, well, I don't know, it took a long time for him to come out with his last book, right? The Two Sources of Morality and Religion. And I mean, I think that the Omega, I don't know, it's obviously a complex view and can be taken in many ways, but it seems more in line with closed morality in Bergson's view, just because it's convergent in a sense, versus open morality, which is all about opening, and is closer to Whitehead, it seems to me. And the focus there a lot is on breaking habits and breaking social cohesion, right? The mystic, and you had this quote from Whitehead about evil or something, right? The appearance of evil from one side, at least in history. Yeah, I mean, I could add more to that, but we're kind of running out of time, so.
Yeah, I know they were both, Teilhard and Whitehead were both deeply influenced by Bergson. The Human Phenomenon was written by Teilhard while he was in China between 1938 and 1940, so it's possible he had read Bergson and was incorporating that text. I don't know if Teilhard's conception of anthropogenesis and noogenesis and Christogenesis is necessarily closed morality, because morality, I think, would be almost transcended if Omega were achieved. That would entail that we would still be individual human beings, but we would care so much for one another that we couldn't even imagine doing something to harm one another. We would feel one another's pain and suffering. So the harm to someone else is harm to ourselves. And so there would be this intrinsic motivation to do and be good and loving, rather than it being an imposed moral custom that's shaping us to do it, Yeah.
We can talk about it more, but Bergson has this idea of the war instinct that is unavoidable in some sense. Like Levinas takes this idea up. So I don't know, I think Bergson thinks there's an ongoing need for new mystics.
Yeah.
For that very reason, that we can't get past that. I don't know.
Teilhard's one of them. Those new mystics, I think, but yeah. What is the moral equivalent of war is a question James asked, right? So what is the motivating vision of the future beyond nationalism? Which is why I think planetary consciousness, which isn't an either-or thing with local consciousness. It's a both-and thing, but...
And who, at that time, besides Whitehead and Teilhard, were doing that, Inspired by Bergson.
Yeah.
Teilhard read Creative Evolution while he was already entranced as a Jesuit, and that's when the world burst alive in time for him is from reading Bergson's Creative Evolution.
Is there one more?
Got time for one last question.
So, I was going to say, I don't know if this is new to me, Teilhard, in this discussion, but I'm just wondering what his economic views were, sometimes I get insight into people's, other views or other parts of their philosophy, if I can understand a little bit about I wouldn't say he was, was he communist or was he atheist, but I'm just wondering where that, because something about this omega point reminds me of communism and this utilitarian kind of ends justify the means. Kind of reminds me of that, so that's why I don't know enough about him to know if that's true. I just kind of wanted to ask you what your thoughts on that were.
He's definitely not a communist, but he did admire the way in which the Soviet Union was able to galvanize this collective spirit and a motivation on behalf of the social body that brought people together in a shared project. He thought that the West was overly individualistic and competitive, but he didn't, obviously didn't admire the materialism and the atheism of it. Another shadow dimension is he said the same thing about fascism, that he was not approving of fascism in the slightest, but the collective spirit that was mobilized by that. He's like, how can we compete? Can liberalism compete with that? Our motivation is so scattered and fragmented. And so he's like, we need a vision that can allow us to maintain, and I think he would want markets, if we wanted to get into the details of that, but the economy should function so as to liberate the creative energies of human beings. He doesn't have the ecological awareness to say that we need to liberate creativity for all creatures in a way and make sure that there's room for all forms of life on the planet, whether for our own self-interest or because we recognize the intrinsic value of all creatures. He doesn't have. We need the Thomas Berry's, Mary Evelyn Tucker's, John Grimm's, etc. correction of that. We need an ecologized Teilhard. But yeah, so he has a complicated relationship to these modern economic ideologies. Yeah.
So it's been a wonderful night, and it's time to liberate the creative energies of man.